Welcome to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Reverend Steve Andrews. Today we read together from Numbers chapter 15. Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, and say to them, when you come into the land you are to inhabit, which I am giving you, and you offer to Yahweh from the herd or from the flock a food offering, or a burnt offering, or a sacrifice, to fulfill a vow, or as a freewill offering, or at your appointed feast, to make a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. Then he who brings his offering shall offer to Yahweh a grain offering of 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with 1/4 of a hin of oil. And you shall offer with the burnt offering, or for the sacrifice, 1/4 of a hin of wine for the drink offering for each lamb. Or for a ram you shall offer for a grain offering 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with 1/3 of a hin of oil. And for the drink offering you shall offer 1/3 of a hin of wine, a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. And when you offer a bull as a burnt offering or sacrifice to fulfill a vow, or for peace offerings to Yahweh, then one shall offer with the bull a grain offering of 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with half a hin of oil. And you shall offer for the drink offering half a hin of wine as a food offering, a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. Thus it shall be done for each bull or ram, or for each lamb or young goat. As many as you offer, so shall you do with each one, as many as there are. Every native Israelite shall do these things in this way, in offering a food offering with a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. And if a stranger is sojourning with you, or anyone is living permanently among you, and he wishes to offer a food offering with a pleasing aroma to Yahweh, he shall do as you do. For the assembly there shall be one statute for you and for the stranger who sojourns with you, a statute forever throughout your generations. You and the sojourner shall be alike before Yahweh. One law and one rule shall be for you and for the stranger who sojourns with you." Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, and say to them, when you come into the land to which I will bring you, and when you eat of the bread of the land, you shall present a contribution to Yahweh. Of the first of your dough you shall present a loaf as a contribution, like a contribution from the threshing floor, so shall you present it. Some of the first of your dough you shall give to Yahweh as a contribution throughout your generations. But if you sin unintentionally, and do not observe all these commandments that Yahweh has spoken to Moses, all that Yahweh has commanded you by Moses from the day that Yahweh gave the commandment, and onward throughout your generations, then if it was done unintentionally without the knowledge of the congregation, all the congregation shall offer one bull from the herd for a burnt offering, a pleasing aroma to Yahweh, with its grain offering and its drink offering according to the rule, and one male goat for a sin offering. And the priest shall make atonement for all the congregation of the people of Israel, and they shall be forgiven, because it was a mistake, and they have brought their offering, a food offering to Yahweh, and their sin offering before Yahweh for their mistake. And all the congregation of the people of Israel shall be forgiven, and the stranger who sojourns among them, because the whole population was involved in the mistake. If one person sins unintentionally, he shall offer a female goat 1 year old for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement before Yahweh for the person who makes a mistake, when he sins unintentionally, to make atonement for him, and he shall be forgiven. You shall have one law for him who does anything unintentionally, for him who is native among the people of Israel, and for the stranger who sojourns among them. But the person who does anything with a high hand, whether he is native or a sojourner, reviles Yahweh, and that person shall be cut off from among his people, because he has despised the word of Yahweh and has broken his commandment. That person shall be utterly cut off. His iniquity shall be on him. While the people of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. They put him in custody, because it had not been made clear what should be done to him. And Yahweh said to Moses, "The man shall be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp." And all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with the stones, as Yahweh commanded Moses. Yahweh said to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel and tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a cord of blue on the tassel of each corner. And it shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of Yahweh, to do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which you are inclined to whore after. So you shall remember and do all my commandments and be holy to your God. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am Yahweh your God." This is the word of the Lord. This opening section of the text, the first couple of paragraphs here, are all about these additional sacrifices. So if you're bringing a lamb, bring with it more. If you're bringing a lamb for a burnt offering, also bring a grain offering and some oil or some wine to come with it as a drink offering for that lamb. And we see that not just for the lamb, but also it's going to continue for the other animals as well, with the ram in verse 6, with the bull in verse 8. And the amounts seem to increase as the size of the animal increases, as you look at the text there. But before we look at that just a little bit more, don't miss what happened in verse 2. Speak to the people of Israel. So this is a common formula, God speaking to Moses to speak to the congregation, and say to them, when you come into the land. That's a big deal, right? Remember what's just transpired in chapter 14. The people of Israel rebelled against God. They rejected God as their Lord. They were about to kill Moses and Aaron, Caleb and Joshua for giving a good report of the promised land and for being faithful. The Israelites, they rejected God. They were done. They were separated, and God took them and condemned them for it. I mean, they do not get to enter the promised land. The adults, those who were numbered in that census earlier in the book, the 603,550 men of age 20 or above in the land of Israel, they don't get to go into that promised land. But their children will. Those who are not yet 20 years old and those who are going to be born in the wilderness in the 40 years to come, those kids get to go into the promised land. And so this verse is that hope. When you come into the land that you are to inhabit, this is God reminding them that the promise still stands. There's a plan. When you get to the promised land, there's a course of action to follow. This is what you are to do. Don't miss that word of hope that the Lord is speaking to those younger people within that congregation. And also the "which I am giving to you" phrase there at the end of the verse has a similar thing to it. I mean, this is a reminder. This is God's promise. This is God's work. He's the one that's going to bring it about on their behalf. Similar to what we see at the very end of the chapter, verse 41, I am Yahweh your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Look at what God has done for you. Trust in what Yahweh has done for you as his people. So as we look at verse 3, the study Bible ends up making a note here about the idea that they may not be making these kinds of offerings during their time wandering around in the wilderness, at least not with the regularity that they will in the future, which is an interesting point to consider. I mean, you think of the limited resources that they have. They don't have their own farmland to produce crops. They don't have their own pasture land to really truly raise their animals. And so to have a limited sacrificial system while they're wandering would be a beneficial thing. I hadn't considered it that way before reading that note, so maybe helpful for you as well. Verse 4 tells us the amounts of those additional offerings. An ephah is, well, a tenth of an ephah is about a half a gallon. So if you think of buying a half gallon of milk from the store, that's about the size that you would consider a tenth of an ephah to be. And then a quarter of a hin would actually be about a quart. So a hin itself would be about a gallon. And so you can figure out these measurements here from that kind of information. It's not the first time we've seen it in the book, but we're seeing it again, that there are not to be different laws for the congregation of Israel and for the people who sojourn among them. That's what the next paragraph here is about. So if those sojourners want to sacrifice to God, by all means, do. And the statute is the same. They shall give the same way that the Israelites give. The trumpets that we had described back in chapter 10 were something that were to be a statute that endured throughout the generations of Israel. And we see that phrase in this chapter, what is it, 3 times? Got it here in verse 15 about these sacrifices. It's again in verse 21 about the first offering of dough. We have it showing up. Let's see. I tried to circle that in my notes. And it's again in verse 38 about the tassels that they'll wear on their garments. So enduring laws that are to last throughout the nation of Israel's history. Which unfortunately, because of sin, is cut short from what it would have otherwise been, as they throw God off of their throne and replace him with a human king that starts that decline. Now, in verse 17, again, you get the "when you come into the land to which I bring you" promise of God, that hopeful statement. Verse 21, this is a question you can ask your kids, why are they supposed to give the first of their dough? Why is first in that statement? Why does first matter? This is a principle of the church in the Old Testament, certainly, but also really still true of us in the New Testament, that the Lord favors first fruit giving. And what that means is the Lord wants you to give of the best of what you have to him, not whatever is left over. Think of Cain and Abel in Genesis chapter 4, that Abel gave his firstborn sheep, trusting that the Lord would provide more sheep for him, whereas Cain just gave whatever was left of his crop. And so the idea of the first is a thing of trust. So today, if your family tithes, for example, which there's no New Testament law to tithe, well, let's say you want to give 20%, or you want to give 5%, whatever you want to give, make it the first thing that you do. We give first. We give to the Lord first and best, trusting that the Lord will continue to provide for us, trusting that what we receive from the Lord's hand will be sufficient to care for our needs, that the Lord will provide for his people. So, thing of trust. The next section is about sin. And so the first paragraph is if the congregation accidentally sins. You see that starting in verse 22. So there's the process for them to go through, the offering of one bull for the entire congregation, to, as you see there in verse 25, to be forgiven. We often forget that. We think of forgiveness and we're thankful for Christ on the cross. The sacrificial system of the Old Testament was for the forgiveness of sin. And so we have an example of this here. Congregation makes a mistake unintentionally. They break one of God's commands. This is how they go about receiving forgiveness from the Lord for it. And then the next paragraph at verse 27, if a person sins unintentionally, here's how they go about receiving the Lord's forgiveness for it. But then in verse 30, that changes. It's no longer unintentional sin. It's sin with a high hand. That's an intent. This is a person that sins intentionally. And this is one to ask yourself, to ask your children. Have you ever intentionally broken God's law? Or an easier question maybe for your children. Did you ever do something that you knew God didn't want you to do? Like you knew God said, don't do this, but you did it anyway? You'd be out. That's the punishment. They shall be cut off from among the people. They're cast out. They're no longer an Israelite. They're removed from the camp forever. And, I look at my life, I'd be gone. I'd have been gone a long time ago. We rejoice in the Lord's forgiveness, and this is an opportunity for you to teach your children that, because we do sin intentionally. The sinful nature rages against us, and we fail. We fail miserably, and we fail a lot. So this is an important gospel conversation to have with your kids, that the Lord forgives, that Christ's death on the cross forgives all sin, no matter how bad it may have been in our eyes, whether it was an intentional sin or an accidental sin. So that's a great gospel moment for a family. Now, as we transition into the next paragraph, this is a tough one. Breaking the Sabbath is described to us as a capital offense, a crime meriting death. The guy was picking up sticks. You may have heard of this story before, even if you haven't read the book of Numbers, because this is a favorite for atheists and people in our culture to trot out against us. You know, as we think of the various problems that our culture has, that the church has tried to speak openly against, and culture mocks us for it. So whether it's, this is typically sexual sin, the idea of homosexuality, same-sex marriage, and the culture stands against that, and our church stands against it, and our culture is, the culture's all for it, and the culture hates the church over this. And this is one of the ones that you typically hear in response. Do you still, you get that law of God from the Old Testament. Do you still not eat shellfish? That's a Levitical thing. Do you still kill people who work on Sabbath? And they'll point to the stick gathering right here, Numbers 15. What's going on in the text? Why is the breaking of the Sabbath a capital offense? It's not the only thing that is. We don't actually have it spelled out in Scripture, so this is an educated guess. This is a capital offense because it is teaching people to not trust in God. This is a theocracy, a literal theocracy, governed by God himself directly. And the people are to trust in God. They're to be his people. They're set apart, unlike any nation on the earth. He is literally in their midst. They are to live for him and through him. And so if they're rejecting that trust that he will provide for them if they take that day off that he's instructed them to take, they are teaching others in the congregation to do the same. And that's dangerous. This is the same reason that dishonoring your parents, when God gives the commandments in Exodus 20, the fourth commandment here for us, and you shall honor your father and your mother. Dishonoring your parents is later described as a capital offense. Why? Because your parents were the ones who were supposed to teach you about God. And if you're not willing to respect your parents, you're not going to learn about God. That's what's going on here. And so they take the person outside the camp. Why? Because the shedding of blood is unclean, and you can't have the unclean things in the camp. So it's a difficult one, but that's the primary concern that's going on. And it's interesting to maybe ponder, does this little paragraph here, does this event fuel the Pharisees' concerns in the New Testament, why they're so legalistic around the Sabbath? It's certainly a possibility that they would have a heightened concern to keep the Sabbath because God takes it so seriously. In the last paragraph today, this idea of tassels on your garments. Again, throughout their generations, God is making them modify their clothing with these extra things. Dad, why do I have a tassel on my new shirt? Well, son, let me tell you, it's because God gave us his commandments and he wants us to follow them. As you're walking around the street, you're going through the marketplace, there you see a guy with his garment on, he's got tassels. There you see another person dressed, they've got tassels. Tassels, 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 tassels everywhere to remind you that you are not your own, that you are God's, and he has commanded you to be his people. He has commanded you to keep his laws, These tassels serve that purpose of being a present, visible reminder. It's their only purpose, is to be a reminder when you see them. This could be an interesting question to talk about with your kids. Do we have anything in our life today to remind us of God throughout the day? And there can be things, right? Some people take a Bible with them. Or maybe, it's an app on your phone, and so it's right there on the home page of your phone. So when you log into your phone, you pass your password there or your lock screen. There it is. You see the Bible app. It reminds you of God. Maybe you wear a cross. I even know a guy that carries a crucifix. That's a way to remind you and also start conversations with others. It's like wearing a wedding ring. It's there on our finger to remind us that we're married, to help us stave off sin and adultery. What things can we do? You can put words of God in various places throughout your day. That can be in your desk. They can be on your wall, a screensaver on your computer. You can have various centerpieces on your table in your house. So as you gather together for a meal, the focus on Christ is returned. The Advent wreath during Advent is a prime example of that. But you can do that throughout the year with other things too. You can just have a standing cross. Or in our family, most of the year, we just have our Bible sitting right there on the table, and we know after dinner's done, we're going to read it together. So lots of examples you can come up with of ways that you can be reminded of God throughout the day, which is what, again, these are for. Tassels aren't the only thing. They were wearing God's law in a little box on their forehead and on their hands as well. So it's a common illustration. The Lord attempting to give his people something to be reminded by, that they would remember that they are his. And lastly, the chapter ends by the reminder, which is the same way the Ten Commandments actually begin in Exodus chapter 20, verse 1, a reminder that Yahweh is their God who brought them out of the land of Egypt. God often, when he talks about his commands, connects it to who he is and what he's done for them. This isn't just some random guy telling them to do whatever. This is their God who has saved them. And because he has saved them, he wants them to live as his people.